On the 18th of March 1889, a series of dramatic events occurred here in the East End of London, heart of the area settled by Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland. A Jewish workers' committee set up to protest against the conditions of labour in the East End clothing industry staged a march to the Great Synagogue on the Jewish Sabbath. The chief rabbi prayed inside, while outside workers demonstrated, calling on him to intervene against the squalid sweatshops in which they toiled. According to the Times newspaper, the Jewish Workers' Committee passed a resolution condemning the indifference of rich Jews. The committee told working Jews not to depend upon the well-to-do, but to organize a strong lobby for the abolition of the entire capitalist ruling class. A riot broke out, and the police made a number of arrests. Similar scenes followed elsewhere. In New York, thousands of Jewish workers marched beneath red flags and trade union banners through the streets of the Lower East Side. And in Poland and Russia, the original home of these immigrants, Jewish workers and artisans mounted strikes against their employers and made plans to resist the autocratic Tsarist government. It was in these years, between 1880 and 1900, that Jewish socialism was born. Within 2 decades, it became a force to be reckoned with, both in Jewish life and in the worldwide socialist movement. This was a remarkable phenomenon. Since emerging from the ghetto and progressively achieving equality in the countries of Western Europe, many Jews had become solid members of the middle class, liberal or even radical in their politics perhaps, but by no means revolutionary. Certain Jews had played a part in the formation of socialist theories and the organization of early socialist movements, but they had done so as internationalists, not as Jewish socialists. Moreover, socialism itself often appeared to be prejudiced against Jews and what they stood for. The fashionable Hegelian philosophers of the 19th century regarded Jews and Judaism as anachronistic. The leaders of the poor and the oppressed saw them as classic members of the bourgeoisie. After all, the Rothschilds, the symbol of international finance capital, were Jews. Jews seemed to have benefited so much from the development of the world economy that it was widely believed that they were instinctively attracted to finance and commerce. One of the radicals who grappled with this question, and who was to exert a profound influence on others, was Karl Marx, buried here in Highgate Cemetery. Marx himself was born a Jew, but was baptized in 1824 at the age of 6. His father converted both himself and his family to Christianity because at a time of anti-Jewish feeling and discrimination in Germany, his career prospects as a Jew seemed very limited. And when Marx wrote his famous article on the Jewish question, he did so in the light of the prevailing intensely negative view of the Jews. To Marx, Judaism was synonymous with capitalism. Marx's theories became orthodoxy for the left, and thereafter Judaism was characterized as a religion of commerce. This bequeathed a legacy of prejudice against the Jews, which went as follows. Jews as economic parasites and creators of capitalism would disappear once capitalism had been overthrown by social revolution. Marx, who systematically underestimated the force that nationalism would have in the modern world, never saw the Jews as a nation. In Marxist theory, there was no place for a separate Jewish identity or for independent Jewish politics. Jewish socialists, on the other hand, would later argue that the Jewish masses had special needs and a separate role in the class war, that Jews were a people that wished to preserve their identity while joining the universal struggle for social justice. To this, Orthodox socialists responded by denouncing these Jews as mere nationalists. If nationalism was a crime, then it was doubly true of Jewish nationalism, which was linked to that opiate of the people, religion. Jewish socialists would always be torn between these two poles. They could either be socialists dedicated to the struggle of the whole proletariat, or they could believe that the Jews were a specific group, doubly oppressed, as Jews and as workers. Moses Hess was perhaps the first true Jewish socialist. He faced the kind of personal anguish and ideological trauma that was to characterize the whole development of Jewish socialism. An early pioneer of German socialism and an important influence on Karl Marx, Hess saw himself first and foremost as a radical German. But he did not altogether shake off his consciousness of being Jewish. Noting anti-Semitic caricatures like this one, he wrote, in a chillingly prophetic statement,
"The Germans hate the religion of the Jews less than they hate their race. They hate the peculiar faith of the Jews less than their peculiar noses."
Inspired by the national rebirth of Italy, Hess ultimately believed that the Jews too could recreate their glorious national past in Palestine, their ancestral home. Hess's vision was not simply a defiant response to anti-Semitism. He was inspired by the doctrines of social justice in Jewish tradition, by the stirring prophetic writings of Isaiah. To Hess, the struggle to liberate oppressed peoples was as important as the class struggle. The refounding of the Jews' own state was part of the universal struggle for the liberation of mankind. Internationalism, he believed, and this is where he differs sharply from Marx, was not incompatible with nationalism, and a Jewish state would offer salvation to the oppressed Jews of Eastern Europe and the Orient, who would form the backbone of a socialist society in Palestine. Hess ultimately tried to reinterpret the Bible and Talmud in modern socialist terms. He contended that the code of Jewish civil law, and particularly the rules relating to the Sabbath, were early forms of socialism. He even quotes from Jewish sources like the Ethics of the Fathers to argue that Jewish morality has always opposed materialism, capitalism, and the selfish pursuit of individual possessions. Hess published his ideas in Rome and Jerusalem in 1862. They fell on deaf ears. The Jews of Western Europe were little attracted by the message of socialism and nationalism. They were too deeply committed to political liberalism and to social integration. As for the still traditional Jewish masses of Russia and Poland, they would discover Hess decades later. Hess's ideas were too far ahead of his time. By the 1880s, however, social and political conditions in Russia were ripening for the acceptance and growth of socialism. In March 1881, a revolutionary group succeeded in assassinating Tsar Alexander II. One Jew, a young woman called 𝗖𝗆𝗱𝗆𝗆𝗆, was implicated in the plot, and certain government circles leapt at the chance to blame the Jews as a whole for this revolutionary ferment. Peasants who owed money to Jewish creditors, small businessmen in competition with Jewish traders, all these needed little excuse to attack those they claimed were exploiting them. The Jews, it was said, not content with killing Christ, had now killed the Tsar. The Russian government encouraged hatred of the Jews in order to draw attention away from their own repressive regime and the gross injustices of Russian society. With the apparent connivance of the police and the army, pogroms swept southern Russia and even rocked the civilized streets and boulevards of Warsaw. Jews who had once pinned their hopes on the steady liberalization of Russia were shocked by the initial indifference of educated people. Some Russian revolutionaries even condoned the murder and pillage. They said it was a regrettable but useful rehearsal for a popular uprising. Those Jews who had chosen the path of revolution felt betrayed by their own comrades. Thousands responded in terror, flocking to the borders to escape the country that had turned so savagely against them. The traditional leaders of Russian Jewry had no answers to give their people except to sit tight. It was left to the intelligentsia and the young to seize the initiative. As the smoke of the pogroms cleared, new Jewish responses began to be seen, defiant responses which were destined to have enormous consequences for the course of Jewish history. The principal Jewish reactions were firstly mass emigration to the West, which brought about the establishment of many new Jewish communities. Secondly, involvement in socialist movements, national and international. And thirdly, the development of Jewish nationalism, which laid the foundations for the Zionist movement. Jewish socialists went abroad in their thousands. They took their radical beliefs to the cities of England and America, creating working-class communities in which Jewish socialists could organize and agitate. Between 1881 and 1914, nearly 2.5 million Jews left Russia, one of the largest group migrations in recorded history. Of this number, some 2 million went to the United States, while further large groups, each of over 100,000, went to Canada, Argentina and England. 43,000 migrated to South Africa, 70,000 to Palestine. But well over half of the Jewish population remained in Russia, and their situation continued to deteriorate. A combination of legal and economic pressures forced the Jews out of the countryside and into the overcrowded cities. They were crammed into a narrow range of occupations: tailoring, shoemaking, metalworking. There was cutthroat competition. Non-Jewish employers were reluctant to hire workers who were literate, who tended to be well informed on the struggle between capital and labor, and who demanded rest on the Sabbath. As a result, almost the entire Jewish labor force was channeled not into factories where they could organize, but into small workshops where they were easily exploited. After the shock of the pogroms, the Jewish revolutionaries who did not emigrate at first took the roles of propagandists and educators. They aimed to introduce to the Jews some of the strategies of the general socialist movement in Russia. They had little faith that the Jewish masses would be saved either by the Jewish bourgeoisie or by the Russian revolutionary movement. Only the Jewish workers themselves could protect their livelihood and their communities. But for this, they needed to be organized. The scattered groups of Jewish socialists were united in 1897 into the General Jewish Labor Union in Russia and Poland, popularly known as the Bund. It was in this house in Vilna that the Bund was founded. Bundist leaders also played a major part a year later in the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the main vehicle for the Marxist revolutionary struggle in Russia. It was the original aim of the Bund to be incorporated into the Russian Social Democratic Party and not to remain independent and isolated. The Bund was active throughout the Jewish working population, organizing Jewish labor, providing educational facilities for the workers, publishing and smuggling socialist propaganda written in Yiddish, Polish and Russian into the Jewish Pale. It also led their strikes for decent pay and working conditions. Under the Bund's leadership, between 1897 and 1904, there were over 2,700 strikes by Jewish workers in the Pale. This was a huge achievement in the repressive Tsarist police state, but the gains were usually short-lived. Far more successful was the Bund's educational and cultural work, enlisting writers, poets and dramatists to create a golden age of Yiddish literature. But the overwhelming reality of Russian Jewish life in this period was the need for the kind of salvation that could only be found outside of Russia. The vast majority of emigrants went to the United States. Most of them went no further than the Lower East Side of New York City, a district overflowing with hardship, crime and prostitution. Another significant place of arrival for the Russian immigrants was England. Between 1880 and 1905, about 100,000 arrived, the majority settling in the overcrowded yet vibrantly alive East End of London, until the Aliens Act slowed immigration to a trickle. Jewish immigrants found jobs in small workshop production like tailoring and shoemaking, familiar from the old country. Frequently, Jewish employers drove their workers relentlessly. This kind of work lent itself to exploitation. There was intense competition between dozens of workshops. The work was seasonal, and the continual arrival of new immigrants forced wages down. In slack periods, thousands were simply laid off. Social and economic conditions were hard. Today, in the East End of London, there are other cultural and religious minorities. But at the turn of the century, immigrant Russian Jews were just laying the foundation of their workers' movement. This proved difficult for several reasons. Most Jewish artisans worked in small, closely knit workshops, which were difficult to unionize. What is more, many of them yearned to leave the working proletariat, to become self-employed, independent. This individualism was reflected at the top levels of the Jewish socialist movement too. Jewish leaders quarreled among themselves about the appropriate political direction of their movement. Consider the difficulties. Each new wave of immigration brought in more cheap labor, more potential strikebreakers. This seemingly endless flow of immigrants gave rise to yet another problem. These aliens were viewed with apprehension and suspicion by English society, including some members of the Jewish establishment. Opposition to the flow of immigrants culminated in 1905 in the first Aliens Act of Great Britain, intended to restrict the arrival of Jews. Despite these problems, Jewish working-class militancy had some dramatic successes. In 1899, 10,000 Jewish tailors in London struck for a month, demanding a 12-hour day and union rates. Their strike succeeded, partly because of the backing they received from some English trades unions. But there was also another factor. In a climate of rising anti-alien feeling, some members of the largely ambivalent Anglo-Jewish establishment now gave their immigrant brethren greater support.
However, Jewish activism was spectacular rather than consistent, and the gains won were soon lost. There was a plethora of small and active trades unions and cultural societies, but their membership was dwindling. Faced with this decline, many socialist leaders left London in despair and headed for new pastures in America. There too, Jewish society was shaken by the arrival of new immigrants. This is how Harper's Weekly depicted New York Jews in Central Park in 1872. 10 years later, things had changed radically. The Russian Jews had by now poured into the tenements and workshops of the Lower East Side. These were the social conditions that would favor the sort of mass organization which Social Democrats from Russia wanted to create. By 1890, there were nearly 30 Jewish unions and socialist groups on the Lower East Side. The word was spread by newspaper editors like 𝗍𝗶𝗁𝗍𝗏, a former Talmudic student and revolutionary from Russia, who established a socialist paper in Yiddish, die Arbeiter-Zeitung. In New York, Marxist socialist ideas took firm root. But as the movement in America grew, it too was riven by ideological disputes. Socialists like 𝗍𝗁 envisaged Jewish socialism as part of the wider struggle for world socialism. Trades unions and the Socialist Party, he believed, were a route into American working life, a form of assimilation. Others saw Yiddish as the key to preserving Jewish identity in America. They fought for a Jewish labor movement that would defend strictly Jewish priorities. But then, in 1903, a traumatic pogrom in Kishinev, back in Russia, triggered a new flood of emigration to America. This aggravated conditions of life and work. However, these newcomers helped to remold Jewish socialism in the United States. It inclined more to Yiddish culture and Jewish issues than ever before. But their radicalism was in no way diminished. During a 3-year period, between 1909 and 1912, American Jewish workers became involved in a series of industrial actions which later became known as the Great Revolt. The pant makers, the waist makers, and 70,000 cloak makers struck at various times. Their demands, anxieties, and conditions of work are clearly mirrored in the pages of a workers' newspaper of the time. And during 1912, it was estimated that 175,000 Jewish workers took strike action in the battle for higher wages, shorter hours, and better conditions. These were vicious industrial wars in which employers and unions hired thugs and gangsters, the employers to break up picket lines, the unions to smash non-union workshops. By the First World War, the Jewish unions had become a permanent, powerful fixture in Jewish working life. Jewish socialists had created a chain of welfare organizations and cultural bodies. Among these were the Workers' Circle and a vibrant Yiddish press. All this was part of a diverse and increasingly rich Yiddish American Jewish culture. The Yiddish Socialist daily, Vorwärts, had a circulation of 150,000. Reading this newspaper, Russian Jews, now settled in America, could follow the progress of the Jewish socialist movement, not only in Der Heim, but also in Palestine.
Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, had always been a focus for the national feelings of Jews. But according to tradition, a return to the Holy Land would come about only after the arrival of the Messiah. However, modern Jewish nationalism, deeply influenced by Western European thought, was to challenge these beliefs. This, combined with oppressive conditions in Russia, made a return to the land now seem an urgent and immediate possibility, even for some religious leaders like Rabbi 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗱, who drew this map in the mid-19th century. It was at this very time that the Middle East, and particularly Palestine, became the focus of European interest and political ambition. European artists like David Roberts came back with paintings and photographs of an exotic Orient which was heavily romanticized. Mark Twain, among others, was more realistic. Under the Turks, he said, Palestine had become depopulated, its glorious past utterly forgotten.
Palestine is a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over entirely to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, the valleys are unsightly deserts. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Palestine is sacred to poetry and tradition, but it is a dreamland.
It was with a dream of their own that the first Jewish pioneers arrived in Palestine in the early 1880s. They had little money, know-how or resources of any kind, but they established a number of small settlements. These pioneers faced the multiple onslaughts of malaria, extraordinarily hard physical conditions, and their despair of ever completing the task they had set themselves of building a society from scratch. By the turn of the century, the enterprise was on the brink of collapse. New idealism was infused into the Jewish settlements by the second wave of emigration from Russia, the second Aliyah, which followed the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903 and the turmoil accompanying the revolution of 1905. The second Aliyah was characterized by a radical new ideology, Socialist Zionism. Socialist Zionists argued that centuries of Jewish history had now to be reversed. They had to break stereotypes of the Jew as being an urban, non-productive, rootless member of society, and present instead a new Jew. Muscular Judaism, as it was called, self-consciously depicted a Jew who stood in marked contrast to the old stereotype: straight-backed, muscular, clean-shaven, working the land. In photograph after photograph, the pioneering socialist Zionists created highly romantic images of themselves. They cleared swamps, built roads, planted crops, and created the basis for a working-class Jewish state. It was this determination to create a total Jewish society, particularly to stress that Jews could be agricultural laborers, that provided the innovative basis for the growth of Jewish economic life in Palestine. The kibbutz was conceived as the ideal way of combining socialism with constructive work, a unique idea of collective settlement. The first socialist settlement was founded at Dagania in 1909. It was successful, and a range of experiments in collective farming and cooperatives followed, rejuvenating and expanding the Jewish presence in Palestine. The philosophy of socialist Zionism was pioneered by Nachman Syrkin. It was in 1896 that 𝗧𝗏𝗱𝗏𝗱𝗏 had published his epoch-making work, The Jewish State. 2 years later, Syrkin wrote his own blueprint, The Socialist Jewish State. By 1914, the socialist Zionist pioneers had carved out the basis of a sound agricultural economy in Palestine. They had set up labor unions, socialist parties, newspapers and journals, a flourishing Hebrew culture. The national revival in socialist form had become, for them, a reality. It was no longer merely a subject for abstract argument in the coffee houses of the Lower East Side. Socialism had by now emerged as one of the most significant influences within the Zionist movement. Socialism had barely been mentioned at the first Zionist Congress in 1897, but only 20 years later, institutions were being set up that would give national shape to the Jewish settlement in Palestine and later to the State of Israel. These foundations were laid by socialists of the Second Aliyah.
Back in Russia, most Jewish socialists did not accept the Zionist remedy. For the Bund, Jewish socialism belonged in the diaspora. So for them did Jewish nationalism, and in 1901, partly in response to the challenge from Zionism, the Bund demanded national autonomy for the Jews within Russia. For international socialists, this was a heresy. As one of them jibed, "The Bundists are Zionists who suffer from seasickness." The rift between the Bund and the internationalists widened. At the Russian Social Democrats Congress in 1903, Lenin and the prominent Jewish revolutionary leader Trotsky themselves led the opposition to the Bund. The Bundist leaders walked out in disgust, a dramatic gesture with far-reaching consequences. And so, for the next 3 years, the Bund operated as a separate party within Russia, and to quite remarkable effect. During the revolution of 1905, which almost toppled the Tsar, Bundists fought on the barricades in Vilna and Riga, side by side with Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. When the government resorted to the familiar tactic of encouraging pogroms, Bundists and socialist Zionists formed defense groups to protect the Jewish quarters. This is the Bundist fighting division in the district of Pinsk in 1905. After these heroic efforts, Jewish socialists attained a new popularity. The Jewish people saw them as their protector. The revolution of 1905 was the Bund's high point in Russia. It was severely damaged in the fighting and by the repression that followed. Only in independent Poland after the First World War did the original Russian Bundism truly survive and flourish. But Bundism, as we have seen, had been exported. In other countries, the Bund had become a fixture of Jewish life, an expression of Yiddish culture, a voice of the Jewish masses. Jewish socialist parties invested huge effort in cultural and political programs, yet in the years following the First World War, generally speaking, they began to decline. Only in the national settlement in Palestine had Jewish socialism become sufficiently institutionalized to blossom. So was Jewish socialism only a superficial occurrence in Jewish history? Was it a one-generation phenomenon, rooted in the experience of upheaval and migration? The children of many immigrants did become professionals, shopkeepers and academics, but it was not for this reason that the movement began to fade away. The Russian Revolution of 1917 paradoxically dealt it a blow. The communist victory divided Jewish socialists into hostile camps. Some joined the communists and advocated assimilation. Others stuck to the nationalist line in the Bund and in the Zionist movement. Jewish socialists outside Russia became prey to the Red Scare that broke out in the West in response to the revolution. In America and England, leaders and some rank-and-file socialists were deported. The post-war slump led to silence and apathy, but the ideals of the movement lived on.
Jews in the modern world have constantly confronted the problem of embracing new philosophies and cultural habits while striving to maintain a conscious link with their Jewish past and Jewish identity. Jewish socialism, in many respects, represented just such a solution. For many identifying Jews, it provided a home in the socialist world, while for some committed socialists, it confirmed their Jewish identity. This heightened consciousness of social and national values grew against the tortured yet exhilarating background of late 19th century Russia. As hundreds of thousands of Jews left Russia, they carried with them, as part of their cultural experience, a set of political responses that included Jewish socialism. Socialist ideals may well be intrinsic to Judaism and the Jewish ethic. That remains an open question. But one thing is certain. Jewish socialism during this period was a phenomenon that crossed national, cultural and ideological boundaries. And at the very time in European history when a handful of Jewish financiers and entrepreneurs fed the myth that Jews en masse were to be identified with the unacceptable face of capitalism, one of the principal shapers of Jewish consciousness was in fact socialism.